welcome back to Rushing the Field, National College Football Podcast from NBC Sports. I'm Nicole Auerbach, joined by my pal and Ohio State National Champion, Joshua Perry. We are back to catch up on all things college football after a few weeks apart. Joshua's got a haircut. A lot has changed in the last couple of weeks, bud.
Many things have changed. It's glad to be back with you. Excited to talk about all the things in the rundown. I just wanted to say to you, watched you on the coverage of the Big Ten men's basketball tournament. Did a great job there on the sidelines. A ton of fun to watch. I love when my friends are out there doing different things and succeeding.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. We are going to be doing some fun projects together in the next couple weeks. We're going to be at Notre Dame's Pro Day. Yes. We're also going to be part of our NBC Sports draft special. So excited for that. We'll get to hang out in person a bunch in the next couple of weeks. But I did want to catch up with you on a lot of topics that you and I have not talked about together. And the first one is related to the draft. So obviously I was at the Combine with our pal Chris Sims and Mike Florio and the whole group. And I was there on the front end. This was before the quarterbacks did all their interviews, before the quarterbacks kind of took center stage. So we need to talk about what's going on with Shedeur Sanders. And for anyone who's been maybe under a rock, or if you've been in the college world, not following it super closely, basically there's a number of reports now that he is, quote, falling on draft boards. NBC Sports' Matthew Berry was one of the people who reported on this after the Combine. He said that he left a bad impression on at least two teams he met during the Combine. Quote, they both said it was a bad meeting and that he came off as unprofessional and disinterested, Berry wrote. Both also said after the meeting they had a lesser opinion of him than prior. These same people met with Cam Ward as well, and both said that they loved Ward and had a great meeting with him. Now, this wasn't the only report. Very similar kind of language and the way that he was presenting himself during these interviews. So that's part of this conversation. You and I have said this, and we talked about it at the Combine as well. There's also just the Deion Sanders factor here, and that he's going to have a microphone. He's going to comment on everything that's happening within a program. If an organization, if they lose, 4 straight games, people are going to be calling for Deion Sanders to be the head coach of whatever NFL organization that is. So Deion himself joined PFT at the Super Bowl and kind of addressed this dynamic and this issue about whether or not he would ever want to coach in the NFL.
Open, or is the door shut for you to go to the NFL and be a head coach?
I would never do that without my kid. Why would I want to go to the NFL and play against my son? That don't make sense to me because I'm comfortable and I love Colorado with all my heart and all my mind and soul. So I couldn't see that happening without that possibility. It don't make sense.
Right. So the door's open, but it's a little bit. It's one specific.
Yeah, I got to be comfortable.
Okay, so again, you're going to have that dynamic the second you lose a few games,
right,
for whatever team drafts Shedeur Sanders. There's also just a lot extra that comes into it. The attention, he's been under the spotlight. Everything that was happening in Colorado was content. Like, we learned so much about how everything was playing out there. And then just the rest of the Deion Sanders factor. So we've got another clip that I want to get to, Joshua. But I want to hear your just initial reaction to the way people are talking about Shedeur coming out of the Combine.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the more intriguing things to me. Shedeur Sanders, when you watch the tape, is one of the best quarterbacks in this draft. I think that's undeniable. A lot of things stand out to me about his release, about, footwork needs a little bit of work. That happens with a lot of quarterbacks coming out of college, but the way he was able to navigate the pocket, always trying to look to make the pass, the 2-minute drills that he used to run were phenomenal. And I think that matters for guys transitioning to the NFL because a lot of these games are close. So there's a ton to like. The personality was always going to be a question. Deion Sanders has raised children that are confident and that speak like he does in many ways. And especially when you're dealing with quarterbacks, I don't think teams are always willing to have a guy who's maybe more outspoken or somebody who's so confident that it's almost like, I'm quiet, I'm kind of sitting back. I think they want a guy to fit a certain mold when it comes to being a quarterback. So personality is a big part of this. And I think organizations are trying to figure out, does this fit into my locker room, especially for a team that's trying to figure out where they're going? I would say I'd look at Shedeur and the fact that He went to Jackson State and had success there, then goes to Colorado where nobody had great expectations for them. He was playing behind a bad line, and he was one of the big reasons why they were able to win games. And I would take that sample size and extrapolate off of that more so than, do I love his personality? A lot of quarterbacks out there who probably aren't, the most personable, best to get along with, that are team players and that can help you win football games. So I'm not surprised that this is where the narrative has gone with him. But I do think that you might miss an opportunity at a potential franchise changer because he's a little bit too confident, or because you felt like he was too cool in a meeting for what you're used to seeing.
Okay, before I react to that, I want to play this clip from the Dan Patrick Show. Louis Riddick from ESPN joined the show and had, I thought, a very interesting take on this dynamic.
Starts with his father, and then it just trickles down to him. And it starts with his father. It's been that way since I played with Deion back in 1992 in Atlanta. People don't like flashy guys like that who can back it up. They just don't. They don't like people who are strong, confident. It's funny. Like, we love it, but then with some people, we don't love it. With Deion, he's always been a polarizing player to the people who don't know him. If you know him personally, you would be like, I get it, and I love it. Give me more of it. With Shedeur, he has some of his father in him. There's no question. How could he not?
Yeah.
He's the man. I mean, he's the man's son.
So I think that that's absolutely part of it. And we talked about this even with the Heisman race, and the way that people were talking about Travis Hunter, Ashton Genty. So much of it was, do you like Deion or not? Right? Like, it was just because he had been so polarizing. The way that he ran people out and the Louis luggage and all of that, like, was coming into play in every single conversation about the Heisman, even when it wasn't said. And I think that that's definitely coming into play here. I'll also put this out. So I was listening to my pal Joe Anderson. He works at The Ringer. He made a point about some of these interviews that we've learned a lot about how teams interact with the players in these interviews. And we're in an era of athlete empowerment. Athletes get paid in college now. The dynamic is very different, where like Shedeur has money. He has had success. He would have branding opportunities, and he doesn't need to like grovel with these teams. He might have a guarantee, or he might know a couple teams that are going to take him, and maybe he doesn't need to like pretend in the other interviews with other teams that want him to be a certain way in those interviews. And that could also be where some of these reports are coming from.
The pretend word is a very interesting one. It was kind of where I was going with this, because there is a part of this process. I went through it when I was going to the NFL, where you do your on-field training, but if you go off to one of these training facilities, a big part of it is they have former NFL coaches that sit down and they will come up with these mock interviews, and they coach you on how to present in front of NFL teams. And you always want to put your best foot forward. You don't want people saying that you come off as unprofessional and disinterested, right? I think there's also this part of it where you don't want to fake it. You don't want to play pretend, because you want the team that's drafting you to understand exactly what they're getting and want just that. And so there's part of it where it's like he could help himself out by tempering his personality. At the same side is like, okay, draft me if you like me. If you don't like me, I'm going to go somewhere else where I'm appreciated for who I am. So I kind of get it. It's an unfortunate situation for him to be in, because we're not talking about the type of talent that he is. We're not nitpicking his game right now. We're nitpicking personality, and that's not a spot you want to be in when you're heading toward the draft.
No. And I think that that's where, like, heading into the combine, a lot of the mocks had clearly kind of coalesced around like Cam Ward QB1, Shedeur QB2, but like it's the drop off that we're seeing. And I still am not necessarily sold on that. I think people get really desperate as drafts unfold, and they worry that guys are going to be taken, and especially for quarterbacks. So I don't think like some of these, how far he's fallen. I even saw somebody had him fall out of the first round. I don't think that's going to happen, but this is a different dynamic in terms of the family, the names, the idea that Deion, is kind of just always hovering, and people are always going to be calling for him to coach, or he could just call into first take if the team's not playing Shedeur the way that he wants to, or he wants a different OC. Like, that is a unique element to all of this. Plus just that he doesn't necessarily need all of the NFL teams to like him. It doesn't matter because of who he is and where he is. And maybe he's just more unapologetic about that, and not just like, oh, I'm so grateful to have all of these interviews, which again, who you are, who you're getting,
Right.
Versus, the way that these interviews have always gone, where the power dynamic is a certain way. Man, we've even had quarterbacks and their fathers who wanted guys not to draft them, right? And they want to maneuver them to get to a certain organization. That's in play here too. There's so many interesting dynamics when you have Deion Sanders as the father of the quarterback that's being drafted.
Yeah, and it's like, it's funny too, because when Arch Manning comes up and it's his time to be drafted, like I think the conversation is going to be so different because of how the Manning family is regarded. But you're looking at a family of gold jackets, and you're looking at Deion with the gold jacket, right? And it's different approaches, and they yield different results from the standpoint of how much you actually like the kid. But you're getting athletes that understand what it means to be pros as well, and I do think that means a lot. Two things real quick on this. The conversation about Cam Ward, and then there, it was like Cam and Shedeur, and then a gap, and then it was like Jackson Dart and the rest of the guys. And now it's like Cam Ward, gap, and they're trying to figure out between Shedeur and Jackson Dart. I don't know if I'm as sold on Cam Ward as everybody else is, because when I watch him, one of the players that I see is Caleb Williams. And for as good as I think Caleb Williams can be, that style of play is tough in the NFL. You can't do the backyard football thing. You got to be able to play more in system. So I am intrigued by that. And just the idea of talking about all of the personality points rather than actually what the X's and O's look like. I think that's where things are starting to get a little bit sideways here. I'm very curious to see how it plays out. The idea that he's going to follow the first round would be crazy to me.
Yeah. This is the part of the pre-draft process I hate, by the way, as well. Like I also hate the nitpicking on skill sets and all of these different things, but I really hate the personality stuff. And the idea that this stuff gets held against someone, or in this case, I really do think that it's because his dad is so polarizing. So
yeah,
we'll continue.
I mean, we saw this a little bit in the NBA too with the Ball brothers and LeVar Ball and how crazy that got. And Lonzo, outside of injuries, like his arrow was pointing up, and then LaMelo has become a phenomenal player, and nobody's really talking about LeVar and all the craziness. And LeVar actually had a point. He was probably right. Two of his three sons, great NBA players, one when he's healthy. But all that to say, sometimes the dad's just a little bit loud, but the kid's going to go out there and do what he needs to do as a pro.
And one of them's a rapper now, right?
Yeah. Yes. He signed himself a little deal.
Okay, let's talk about another big story in college football. And this one I know is near and dear to your heart. Eddie George being hired at Bowling Green. This was a very late coaching change. Scott Loeffler left to become the quarterback coach of the Philadelphia Eagles. And Eddie George comes in and gets this job back in the state of Ohio. There was so much fanfare around this hire, the announcement. I'm seeing it's like the Bowling Green social team. It's like every minute of every day of Eddie George. Like they're so excited that he is the head coach. We had seen him, in the HBCU ranks in college football. He was getting his experience in, but you don't always see coaches, even when they do well in HBCUs, able to make that move into, in this situation, the MAC. So you've spent a lot of time with Eddie George, and you've talked to him a lot over the last couple of years. So I know you're pumped about this hire, but walk me through all of the emotions, all of your thoughts, and what you know about him as a college football coach as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start off by saying, Eddie and I have become friends. He was a guest on a different show that I was doing, and we had him on weekly during the season. He was phenomenal for us, just from a preparation standpoint. He was okay going there talking about some of the big issues in college football. He was okay going there talking about other teams and other players and other coaches, which is it's an awkward spot, but it's just his view of the game of football. There's a lot of knowledge, and I think he really wants to share it. What he did at Tennessee State was really good. For the first time since 2013, they made the FCS playoffs. They won a share of the conference for the first time since, I believe, 1999. Tennessee State had not had that level of success. He comes in there, has to rework the roster, but he built culture. And that's one of the things that I had talked to him about, the mentality of the team, demanding a certain standard for his program. He wants to be tough. He's an old school guy. He played running back He's like, we want to run duo. My offensive line needs to be great. I need to have running backs that don't run out of bounds when they're near the sideline. Is one of the things he told me verbatim. And he said, we want to challenge everything and be aggressive on defense. And so I think that mentality is something that shows through when he's talking to, ADs and even NFL teams. He had an interview with the Bears, and he told me he understood it was more of a Rooney Rule thing for them, but it was great for him to get that experience and to get feedback there on his coaching journey. But we're seeing now some of the more non-traditional coaching candidates, right? Like we just talked about Deion and his path. I think Eddie's is similar from the standpoint of great NFL players, but these are not guys who would take the traditional route of becoming an intern or a GA and working their way up that way. So you go to a small school where you get the opportunity and show that you can actually coach. And even for Eddie George, similarly to Deion, he's worked in the media. He was on Broadway, so he knows how to captivate and how to present to groups of people. He's a guy who has a master's degree from Northwestern. He's had many businesses. So he probably understands the importance of getting money and fundraising and how the finances of an athletic department work, particularly at places that aren't as financially advantaged as some of the big schools. For all of those reasons, I think he's going to be phenomenal. Add in on top the idea he was a Heisman Trophy winner in the state of Ohio. He knows what football means to this state. He understands high school football in the state of Ohio. It felt like a no-brainer. We had talked offline. I had mentioned Eddie George as a potential for other jobs if they would come open, because that's how much I respect him and his football acumen, his ability to build culture. But I think Bowling Green's going to be a really good spot for him. And I'm excited to see what this thing looks like.
Yeah, I actually think like he's walking into the program in a pretty decent place as well, and it is a really late coaching change. A couple notes. My pal Richard Johnson had a good piece over on CBS. Urban Meyer was involved, pushed this as an out of the box name onto Bowling Green athletic director Derek Vandermeer's radar, which worked. And then the actual phone call to Eddie George, he was actually driving through Bowling Green, Kentucky. So that was very funny. A couple little faded moments there. And then the athletic director made a really interesting point. He's trying to find a positive in a really late coaching change. And he brought up the fact that the portal is closed right now. Now it's going to open again briefly after spring ball, but it's not like you're making the change while it's open and guys might just be right out the door. They're all going to have time to, quote, for the coach to have, quote, an on-ramp into that relationship, demonstrate that person's really committed to the well-being and development of the players. So that's the advantage, that Eddie George will have time to sit down with these players before they make a change or decision that they want to go out because the coach that recruited them is gone. And I think that's actually a really interesting point, because we have seen some really late changes because of the NFL cycle. And they've hurt some of these teams, and certainly in like a recruiting cycle and all of that. First of all, you've got to think that Bowling Green's going to be patient here because, with the situation they got put in. But also, like, yeah, I want to sit down with Eddie George and see what he's like and see, if this is someone I could play for. That's awesome, right?
Yeah, I mean, that is 100% it. And I think that his mentality is about the players and about developing young people, right? Not just as football players. We talked about his academic plans, things of that nature. He's also got children that are around that age too. So I think he understands who young people are right now. But you would be crazy if you're in that locker room and Eddie George says, hey, schedule a meeting. We're all going to sit down for 15, 20, 30 minutes. I'm going to get to know you. You're going to get to know me. And you roll your eyes at that opportunity, right? Like I do think it is a big chance for him to be able to build relationships and really figure out what they're going to be like in year one.
Yeah. What do you make of kind of Bowling Green's place in the pecking order? Like what the opportunity is in the MAC, in recruiting. It's like those programs do get ravaged by the portal and guys trying to transfer up. What do you think about kind of the actual situation from a football standpoint?
Well, I think that Eddie understands that dynamic of it, players trying to move up and rosters getting poached. He had talked about that happening at Tennessee State. You develop a guy, all of a sudden he becomes a good player. Somebody else is looking to get him. So I think he's prepared. It's not going to be a surprise there. In terms of their pecking order in the MAC, I think they've got a pretty good opportunity here. I mentioned high school football in the state of Ohio. I'm biased, but you can look at actual numbers and it'll tell you some of the best players in the country come out of Ohio. There are a lot of guys who would love to stay in state and go to one of these schools. And there have been pipelines from some of the powerhouses in Ohio. One of the schools outside of Columbus, they were sending guys to Ohio State. And if they weren't going to Ohio State, a lot of those guys ended up going to Bowling Green. And so for him to build those relationships and to kind of carve out their role, and he's going to be competing against, everybody for those kind of next tier players that aren't off to big schools. But if you can kind of make that your place in recruiting, particularly in the Midwest, focused on the state of Ohio, he's going to have an opportunity to put together rosters that on a year-to-year basis will be good. He's going to have to figure out the turnover aspect, and that's a part of the challenge there. But initially, I think he can get good players in.
Yeah, and it's a great point. Having been at a lower level where guys are trying to leave, and if you are all conference, those are going to be the types of guys that guys come after. So I think that is a really interesting dynamic. I think that's something that we need to constantly reinforce and emphasize when we talk about guys that have success at lower levels. When they come up, they're used to that part of it. But right, this is going to be a fascinating dynamic to watch. You've still got Michael Vick at Norfolk State. Like
Yes.
this era of like great player coming in and approaching their college football coaching career this way is really, really interesting. And I love that we're going to get to see it happen at a number of different places across the country. So we will have all eyes on Eddie George and Bowling Green for sure. Next topic that we got to catch up on this because it's kind of taken on a little life of its own because there's not a lot happening in college football. So people are talking about spring games and whether or not they're worth having. Now, I think it's important to say, like, a lot of people are not really doing spring games. Like, they're not really playing. It's a glorified practice. You get a couple of drills or you get excited about, the freshman receiver that everyone wanted to come see. But at a place like Nebraska, this was a big deal. They could sell out for the spring game. And Matt Rule kind of kickstarted this entire news cycle earlier this offseason, where he said, like, it's not really worth doing because of tampering, because of poaching. Quote, I don't necessarily want to open up the whole outside world and have people watch our guys and say, he looks like a pretty good player. Let's go get him. I dealt with a lot of people offering our players a lot of opportunities after last year's spring game was televised on Big Ten Network. To go out and bring in a bunch of new players and showcase them for all the other schools to watch doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Again, 60,000 people went to Memorial Stadium to watch that spring game last year. So you have a couple elements here of like the community and the fan base, usually having this benchmark in the spring to get excited about the next year's team and that connection in the community. You do, in general, have fears about the transfer portal. Like the other portal window is either during or right after spring ball for everybody. But a couple of other schools have kind of followed suit and say, like, we're not doing this, or we're not opening one practice like we sometimes do. I can't get that worked up about this. I see the arguments, and I do think that there's a ton of value in doing things that are open to your fan base, but I don't think it necessarily has to be like a spring game. I just think that the overreaction of canceling or people are going to poach our guys based on what they see is a little bit overwrought because it's a glorified practice. Like, you're not getting a ton out of these guys. These are still guys that people might have tried to hit up and tried to get to transfer with or without film.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you on that. The last part is, I think if there was an opportunity to see some of these guys, I still think that teams would try to poach them. I don't think that you should make it easier either. I've talked to college football coaches about this, and they have flat out said, yeah, we watched the spring game and we got our eyes on certain players to see if there's somebody we would want to go after. So I think Matt Rule does have a point there. I think there's a big missed opportunity, though. We're in a day and age of branding, and we're in a day and age of marketing in this sport. And I think a spring game, number one, is just goodwill for the fan base, because especially at a lot of these places that sell out in the regular season, there are fans that just can't get there, right? Like, they can't afford to do the game day experience. And spring is a much more laid back, comfortable, affordable way to take a family to watch their favorite team. And so I think that missed opportunity is like, you're missing a way to market to people you can't get to typically on game day. The other part of this is the whole NIL thing. if I'm not doing a spring game, I am certainly doing something where I can raise funds for name, image, and likeness surrounding my team in the spring. There is an opportunity here that I think people would be missing if they just completely said we're not going to open anything up. But I'm kind of in your camp. I don't know how mad I can really be about this or how strong my feelings are. But I do think that there are opportunities that are out there to market your team and to build goodwill without necessarily doing the whatever you call your scrimmage, where nobody's tackling to the ground anymore.
Right.
Nobody's going up and down the field live. Like, we can figure this thing out, but it's just going to have to look different.
Yeah. And I mean, as someone who's watched the televised spring games, you don't get a ton out of it because it is a bunch of different practices, a bunch of different formations. They do a couple things, but it is for some of these fan bases. Ohio State's one, Penn State, like the blue-white game. Like, I have friends who graduated from Penn State that for, the 10 years after they graduated, that was the weekend they all came back. Like, that was a more accessible weekend to come back and visit the campus and have that tied to the school. So I think you are trying to weigh all of those factors. And I don't think you want to like completely cut off your community, cut off your school. But I do think that there's ways to do this. And maybe it's like you said, maybe it's other events that are, getting the players out there without the actual football exposure and seeing someone run routes.
I'll say this too, in terms of bringing people back to campus, like you mentioned at Penn State. I know at Ohio State, that is a huge weekend for former players to come back and to be able to like be on the field because during the season, that sideline is absolutely crazy. And that's a big recruiting tool. When you have the recruits in for the spring, is to see guys who had success, Braxton Miller down there with his kid, and how much of a family it feels like when guys are able to come back and the lifelong connection that they try to sell, that becomes real when you can have players there and they're visible and they can kind of do the hobnobbing thing. So again, there's a trade-off with this in saying that we want to protect our roster. That's perfectly fine, but you are missing some of the great opportunities that did exist before in terms of building your program and marketing your program.
And if there's a quarterback battle, we get to like parse through who got more snaps and we get to evaluate.
The spring quarterback takes might be crazier than the NFL draft takes.
That's not true. That's not true. I disagree with that. But yeah, there's a lot of negatives around these things with something like that, like a very early stages of a quarterback battle, and everyone freaks out because, someone has one more completion than the other in their amounts of time. Like,
crazy.
It's all crazy. Or you're comparing one of the guys went against the ones and one went against the twos for the defense.
Or Justin Fields has a bad day and all of a sudden
and the world is ending.
Transfer. Right.
Yeah. Will Howard didn't play that well in the
no. I mean, none of those guys ever do. I feel like all the Ohio State quarterbacks have bad spring games and end up being pretty good in the regular season.
I think that's more important. That's where I would land on that. So yeah, we will have some spring games in the coming weeks. We'll have more information from spring practices from more places. And so I don't think it's a huge deal, but I do worry that, I don't want everyone to cut off their access to their fans, to their communities, and just in general pro-transparency. But I agree. I think that these are valid concerns. And I think there's ways to do it where you're not really showing much, but I think that there's other alternatives as well. Joshua, one other major piece of news. We got a couple of quick hitters we'll get to. Dan Lanning and Rich Rod made some headlines recently this week, but there was huge news in the ACC. So ACC, Florida State and Clemson reached a settlement. Now this has been like kind of hanging over college sports for 2 years, actually probably more than that. Everyone's wondered, hey, is the ACC going to break open? Are Florida State and Clemson's lawsuits going to be successful and invalidate the grant of rights? Is there any way that they can pay whatever the dollar figure is going to be and then get to the Big Ten or the SEC? We've had these like hypotheticals for a long time. And everyone has wondered, like, is the ACC going to survive this? Well, the answer is yes, for at least like 5 years, because they reached a settlement here, which I think, we'll talk about like if we think there are winners or losers in the actual agreement. But here's what it was. The penalty to leave the conference has now been significantly reduced. The grant of rights remains in place through 2036, But starting next year, the exit fee starts to decrease. So it's $165 million next year, and then it declines by $18 million per year. And when you get to 2030 and 2031, it's $75 million. Big number, but like that is an approachable number compared to the numbers that we've seen and the estimates that like FSU's lawyers had come up with about what it would take to leave right now. If you leave in 2030 and you pay that $75 million, you can leave with your media rights intact. So, you can like immediately, your new league can play your games and the value is there. That the timing of that exit penalty reduction is really important. So the Big Ten's media deal comes up around then. The Big 12's media rights deal comes up again around then. The CFP deal comes up. ESPN's deal with the SEC a couple years later. And also the NCAA's deal with March Madness, men's and women's, all up around then. So I've already been saying that like the end of the decade is a very significant period of time for like full-on shifts and changes possibly with the business model. One other piece to this is that like there's a new revenue distribution model. We know the ACC had already gone to like a success-based thing. Like if you win or made the CFP, you get to keep more money. Now you also get some more money because of your brand initiative and recent viewership, so that the teams that are drawing and carrying the football product will get paid as such. Something FSU has been clamoring for a couple of years. So all that being said, what it looks like to me is that you have stability here for a few more years, but you have outlined a path for these teams to leave in 2030. And most changes tend to be around when media rights deals are up. That's when the Big Ten added the last time. That's when the SEC added right around when they were redoing their deal. And I think that if there is going to be a shift to a super league or some sort of breakaway, the top 40 brands, the top 60 brands doing something separately, pulling football out, whatever, all of those, back of napkin math and conversations we've done, I think that it makes sense to if you're Florida State and Clemson, be available around that time. Here's the dollar figure to hit for raising money, whatever you need to do. But also, I think this prepares everyone for that landscape, like that there is a pathway to it if the world looks like it's doable, if media rights look like that's possible. You don't know what that's going to look like yet. You don't know how the House settlement and revenue sharing is going to impact people's budgets and what they want to compete at in college sports. So to me, I think everyone can sell it as a win. Like the ACC can sell it as like we stay together and Clemson and Florida State are still here. But I think if you're Clemson and Florida State, you feel great about this outcome. You're getting more money in the short term, and you've got a clear exit ramp if you want to take it in a few years.
That's how I see it. It feels pretty significant that you now have clarity on what you need to do if there were the opportunity to get out of the conference for Florida State and Clemson. So that's a good thing. I think about some of the teams that are kind of, if you're one of the other teams, especially kind of the bottom of that conference, I don't think any of this makes you feel any better. Your revenue distribution is now going to be probably lower than what you were anticipating. And there's this idea that your conference probably will not be, however you want to see it, be intact by the time we get to the end of the decade, start the new one. So it's a weird spot. I do think that the pretty clear winners in my mind are Florida State and Clemson here. But I am curious, though, now that we have this, where everybody's mind is going, because you did mention, like, I think if you're the Big Ten, for example, you can't take on any more teams unless you want to get in the business of cutting teams out. The way the schedules are right now, they're too imbalanced in football. The conference is entirely just like too big for it to make a lot of sense. So you probably do have to turn the page to, are we going to do just like a different division of football with, different regional conferences that overlap with scheduling and different things that happen there? That's what I'm curious about now, is the shift in mentality for some of these other conferences and some of the top teams and what they think business is going to look like in the future.
So it's a really good point about like the other teams in the leagues and the teams towards the bottom, like the least valuable ones, because I think that this outcome for the ACC doesn't happen if the Pac-12 doesn't implode.
Right.
Because those schools had an unequal revenue distribution with the LA schools where they made more money. And they fought back and they went back to an equal revenue distribution. And like everyone knew that USC and UCLA were unhappy, especially USC. But there was that like push towards it and it got overruled and then they left and that, began the crumbling of the Pac-12. And so I think you had teams and schools and administrators who saw that happen. They don't want to be Washington State and Oregon State where they just completely get left behind and have to rebuild at a lower level. And so they're like, yeah, okay, fine. We will. Yes, Florida State and Clemson can make more money. Like they are investing at a higher level. They're more successful on the field. So yes, we will do that to preserve the league, which does not set you up well for your future, especially when you are going to be having this new line item of paying the players and the rev share piece. But I think it's to preserve the league, to have a home. And again, you have deadlines now. Like you have a period of time where you can make decisions. You need to fundraise. If you need to think about dropping down a level, like to your point, or cutting different sports to, maneuver things the way that you want as an athletic department, you know what you need to do by then. And the ACC has always been a weird conference where football is driving so much of where college sports is going, but there's so much basketball history in this league. And like you, again, have the Florida States and Clemsons with the football spending, salaries, all of that. And then you have like Boston College that like doesn't even have scholarships for swimming. So like you have such a wide range of what are we doing here? What is our goals? That I think it was always going to be an interesting and strange dynamic. But the fact that you open the door to unequal revenue sharing in this conference gets to the point that you said, either about cutting teams or changing the revenue distribution in other leagues where certain teams are really carrying it, right? Or they're the ones that are the most valuable teams. They drive the viewership. They drive the reason that, Fox and ESPN and everyone's willing to spend so much on the media deals because, they want the Ohio State. Like, so Ohio State, should they make the same amount as Purdue? That that question does come. I don't know. I feel like a bunch of people were like, oh, immediately, like the Big Ten, the SEC will do unequal revenue sharing. I don't know if that's true because I think in the Big Ten, I think like the even sharing is part of like the ethos of the conference.
Yes.
Same in the SEC, and it incentivizes investment for everybody else by bringing in money. So I don't think that's like a clear cut thing, but it definitely is a conversation now because we just saw it happen in the ACC. And a lot of people think at some point people will be like, here's what I bring. I should get paid what I bring relative to what my neighbor brings.
It's so tough for me because I understand the business and I understand how these things work and how people would feel, administrators, right? Like coaches, how they feel about their programs. But the word cutting is really tough for me, right? Like if you're kind of kicking teams out of conferences, that's tough. And the idea of what happens in these athletic departments at Ohio State, I think it was 36 varsity sports, right? And like they have tried to say that we're committed to making sure that we can have all these sports. There are other athletic departments that are large like that. And I became a lot of friends with a lot of athletes from other teams that had opportunities to be on campus because of what they did and the fact that there was a sport that they could play there. And I struggle with those opportunities potentially evaporating in this changing landscape. So I think that's the other side of it that's like really tough about all these things as we look at it. And, we're kind of trying to make the math work and seeing the way that the pieces fit in. But, there are young people who want to go to school and want to be a part of a sport that have had opportunities for a very long time that might not in the future because of the way that shifts are happening in collegiate athletics.
Yeah, I always say this, I repeat myself, but I think it's worth it. Like, this is not a business model you would set up if you started it today. You would never have, one or maybe two sports essentially bringing the money to subsidize everything else.
Yep.
And you wouldn't do it with the conferences either, where like a couple of them kind of, again, subsidize everybody else. Like, because it wasn't supposed to be like a major business, right? Like this was about like providing opportunities and scholarships for athletes.
Yeah.
And that goes out the door when coaches are making $10 million, $11 million a year, and March Madness is $1 billion entity. And so it's not set up to operate and maximize like profits and margins and all of the different things that you would if you set it up differently as business, which is why you have these Super League proposals where people are like, we could extract so much more money out of this.
I struggle because I believe that there are certain institutions that do not need to be businesses and should not operate with the business-like mentality. And to your point, for a very long time, nobody was really getting rich off of collegiate athletics. Coaches were not getting rich. The TV was not as big as it is. You couldn't watch every game every weekend on television somewhere. And to your point now, TV contracts, absolutely ridiculous. I benefit from this, by the way. I cover the sport, so it's not like, I'm not getting a piece of the pie here. Some of these coaching contracts, you got position coaches making over $1 million a year. You ask a guy in the 80s about that, he would probably faint and tell you that you're crazy. But this is a world that we're in right now. And I can appreciate it, but I also feel like certain things don't have to be a business.
Yeah,
this has to be now. We're past the point of return, right? Like,
well past it. Yeah. And that's why you have, these people hiring GMs with pro sports backgrounds who understand cap management. It's why you have athletic directors and commissioners coming from pro sports and other areas. Like, it is becoming more and more of that, but this is exactly the kind of space where, like, there's so much tension, especially around decisions that might be cutting sports and those opportunities, which, again, people who work in college sports or devoted their whole life to working in college sports did it because they believed in those things. Yes. So this stuff becomes very, very challenging as we get closer to the House settlement being implemented. And again, these questions about an eventual super league. Speaking of salaries, though, Dan Lanning is our latest coach who got a nice bump. He has agreed to a new contract with Oregon. It will raise his average salary close to $11 million annually. Oregon says the deal will run for 6 years through 2030. His buyout to leave remains $20 million. Athletic director Rob Mullins said in a statement, Oregon football has reached historic heights under Dan's leadership. His relentless commitment to providing a first-class student-athlete experience is evident in the culture he has fostered within his program. His dedication to the university, our student-athletes, and the city of Eugene has put Oregon football in position to compete for championships on a yearly basis. Lanning, we've talked about this. He's still young. He's only 38. He's been a head coach for 3 full seasons, and he's 35-6 during that time. We all know how the season ended. The Rose Bowl in that blowout loss to Ohio State. But what do you make of this? Dan Lanning's the guy that we always talk about. We talk about him as kind of who we'd want to be the head coach if you're starting from scratch in 2025. But he has not won. He did not win a college football playoff championship. Right. This was a team that people thought should. A lot of us picked them to win it all this year, and they come up short. So what do you make of a restructured deal and a bump up into that $11 million range?
I think he deserves it. He's one of the faces of college football right now. So I think he should be paid like that. The results on the field the last handful of years, but in particular, this year is the most consistent team in college football in the regular season, won the conference championship. And unfortunately for them, you run into Ohio State with the chip on their shoulder playing the way that they were in the postseason. Like, that's something that I can rationalize there. I do think it is intriguing, though, that he is being paid in the realm of coaches that are championship coaches. You've got Kirby, you've got Dabo, you've got Ryan Day, who is making a ton of money now. Bill Belichick has not won a college football national championship, but he's got a lot of them as a pro coach. And so that, to me, sets an expectation for results. But I do think this is an intriguing one. Me, as somebody who is on the outside of the Oregon sphere, would not look at Dan Lanning's tenure at Oregon if he never won a championship and said that it was unsuccessful, because nobody else has done that there. They have not won a title. And so I'm curious about what expectations are. The fan base is going to have their expectations, which I totally get. But as a collective of college football watchers, does the 11 million automatically set an expectation that you expect him to win a championship? And if it does, I do think that's an interesting spot for a place that has not won one yet.
I think there probably is a little bit of that, of now that is the expectation. But I think that's true in general because of where the program is, right? Like, everyone's been waiting for that next step. And, people thought that was kind of the narrative around them this year. Would they take that step? And, getting the number 1 seed, the only undefeated team, like, there was a lot of that expectation around them already. So I think that the dollar sign adds to it, but there was already going to be pressure. And
No
Dan
doubt.
Lanning himself has not shied away from that. Like when his name gets attached to A&M opening and all these other places last year, Alabama, he was like, no, I got what I need. I can win a championship here. So to me, the question's never been about resources. So I guess we could say, okay, yeah, his dollar figure is going to be in the same as the championship caliber guys, but their commitment to facilities and everything else, NIL, was already there, right? So like you already had that spending and that level of resources. So I don't know that this necessarily even changes that. I think it's just where the program is. It's like, okay, you've been to the CFP. Okay, you've had Heisman Trophy winners. Okay, you have had Heisman finalists. Okay, you've advanced. You've won a championship in your conference. You've done this. You've done that. This is the next step. And to your point, it's very hard when you've never done it before. We now only still have 3 active coaches that have national championships. Really, really hard to do. And you need a lot of things to go right. You need injury luck on your side. You need matchups to fit well. So it's not like a foregone conclusion. And if what you pay your coaches and what you paid your roster guaranteed championships, A&M would have won one a couple years ago, right? It's just it's hard to say. So to me, I don't think it changes anything. I think it just reiterates that Oregon is willing to spend just like the best teams in the program, and that they believe that is like absolutely necessary, non-negotiable piece of the foundation to win a championship.
No, I'm totally there. That's how I see it. Is you have to be committed in order to be a program that can win a championship. But I do think when you're paid in that realm, for some people, it does flip this switch of like, well, that's the expectation that you're telling us, is that you think he's like these other guys. And so down the line, he needs to produce like that. I'm not willing to get there because that's not a place that has traditionally done it. I think they absolutely can. It's not to say that I don't think that they can, but to say that's like the one thing I would judge him off of, which people might start to do now, which is a weird thing that we love to do in this sport, I'd pump the brakes. I think he's doing a phenomenal job, and he earned this pay bump.
Yeah, I do too. I think this is like a normal salary and like contract renegotiation for someone that would be atop my list for any job that opens.
For sure.
And is having success, and did, beat Ohio State and did win the Big Ten conference. So to me, that's normal. This is different than like Jimbo Fisher's contract, which was fully guaranteed, super long. And it lent itself to, okay, this is how much each loss costs.
Right.
Because like of what you're paying this person. That felt different. This feels more in line of like what college football coaches in that echelon should be, even though I didn't have a title. I think, again, just the way that he builds his program, the way they play, the way he recruits, and how coveted he is anytime any other job opens, this makes a lot of sense to me.
No doubt. It's just the whole, BK down at LSU, right? Like, I think people are getting tired of that.
Yeah, it's worth it. Are you getting your money's worth?
We're doing the Lincoln Riley thing. I think the Sark thing has become a little bit interesting there, where this year I think people really do believe that they can win. But if they don't, and how much he's being paid, like that's where we get into these conversations, and like the scope gets so narrow. We did it with Ryan Day for a while until he won it. Like I think we should, avoid that conversation and just appreciate the idea that this is one of the big players in college football and he deserves this.
So last tidbit, a little bit on a lighter note, but there's a lot of interesting elements to it. Speaking of guys who get paid, and that there are certain expectations or parts of your job description that are attached. Rich Rodriguez, the new and old West Virginia head coach, he has banned his players from TikTok dances. So he's not banning them from TikTok. They're allowed to be on TikTok. But he's banning them from dancing on it. It's like, look, we try to have a hard edge or whatever, and you're in there in your tights dancing on TikTok. Ain't quite the image of our program that I want. I'm allowed to do that. I can have rules 20 years from now. If they want to be sitting in their pajamas in the basement eating Cheetos and watching TikTok, whatever the hell, go at it. Smoking cannabis, whatever. Well, what a quote. Knock yourself out. But as for now, I hope our focus can be on winning football games. How about let's win the football game and not worry about winning the TikTok? So, man, Rich Rodriguez, great quote. I covered him at Michigan. He will say what he thinks.
Yes.
So this is an interesting one, and I've seen a couple of different reactions to it because, like, it is part of, Travis Hunter, like a bunch of these guys, like there's TikTok videos. stuff that goes into your brand, your social media platforms. I get all of that. But I guess the question I have for you, Joshua, is now that these guys are getting paid and they're going to get paid from West Virginia, can you do things like this? Can you implement rules where you're like, you're not allowed to do this?
I mean, the
That's what I
NFL does
said.
it all the time, and they've got fines if you don't follow their rules. They'll take the money out of your pocket that they just gave you. So this is how I feel like I would be if I was a coach, and this is also the reason why I say that I couldn't be a coach. I'm not
Yeah,
exactly
you're like,
sure
you're also like 80 years old. So you
I
would like,
am.
you wouldn't let them like even have cell phones.
I am. No, you have a flip phone. That's it. But you know that I feel like this might not be the best winning formula. I like it though. Like the idea behind it is the reason why I'd be this way. We want to have a hard edge. You dancing in your tights does not present that to me, right? Like you might be focused on the wrong things and you're giving off an image that doesn't necessarily say football team. We talked about Matt Rule earlier in the show, and he banned TikTok inside the facility, and they've got the TikTok workout if you break the rule. I'm not necessarily mad about this. I think especially for a program that's in a phase of installing a new culture and building and trying to get back to what they once were, you might have to do these things for a while. When you start winning games, then maybe you get the TikTok back. Maybe you do. Dangle the carrot out there. But as of right now, I have no issue with this.
It's an interesting one because we have seen so much of college sports lean in the player direction of like not putting rules around them, anything that could possibly restrict like your earning power, your ability to transfer, whatever you want to do, your voice. And here comes a coach being like, listen, I'm not going to say like you can scroll, you can stay up all night looking at your TikToks, watching videos as much as you want, but you know, you can't like spend all this time filming them. Right. And so, it's going to be interesting because I'm sure the second that they start losing or struggling, people will be like, he's being too tight. He's not letting his players like, you know, be who they are. But I'm with you. I don't mind it. I think rules are allowed to exist.
Yes.
And I think especially we're moving into an era where the schools are going to be paying their players directly. Some of these schools are being paying $20 million to their athletes each year.
Yeah.
I think you're allowed to be like, well, here's what our expectations are with you. Like, these are jobs. I know they're not calling them that. I know NCAA fights the idea of employees, employers, but that's what these are. And the contracts look that way. And so I think it's okay to be like, here's what I expect, or you can't do this in like a football facility. Like you can't film X, you know, like there are rules like that around this in every other profession.
Right.
And so I think this is a funny headline, but I sort of see where he's coming from.
See, I'd try to get some of that money back. I'd have a whole fine schedule and be putting that money right back into the program. The best part about this, though, is the sitting in your pajamas in the basement, eating Cheetos, watching TikTok, smoking cannabis, whatever. That is a real old guy rant, and you know I'm here for it.
I was going to say, that sounds like something you would say. That really sounds like something you would say.
Yes.
Joshua, it has been lovely to be back with you and your old man's yelling at the cloud takes as always. Yes, that's exactly what this is. But we'll be back plenty. We're back on our normal schedule. And like I said, we're going to be together for some NFL draft stuff coming up with our pal Connor Rogers, our guru over at NBC Sports. He does a fantastic job with the draft. And then we will be covering Notre Dame's Pro Day on March 27th on Peacock. So you can also catch us there. We'll have interviews with Marcus Freeman and everybody else in South Bend. So again, stay tuned. Rushing the Field's not going anywhere. We'll be together. We'll have more content coming your way on this feed. For Joshua Perry, I'm Nicole Auerbach. Goodbye, and thanks for hanging with us.